أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك النبي الأمي اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدر المقدار العظيم ورضي الله تعالى عن أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم يا همة الشيخ اهدري لنا بهذا المحضر ولتأتفي بنظرة تأتي لنا بالظهر. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How's everybody doing? Can you hear me pretty good? Alhamdulillah. So, like my good friend and colleague David mentioned, my name is Rasul Miller. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out. And my work, as he mentioned, looks at the history of Islam among Black Americans in the U.S., most specifically New York City. And I was asked by Sister Patty to, I hope you all know Sister Patty, exactly here. If you don't, you should know. You should get to know her for folks who might be from the community and not just from Penn. And we talked about me giving a talk to kind of share some of my work and the insights from my work. I imagine part of the impetus might have been the fact that it's Black History Month. And one of the things that we also brought was bean pies. So afterwards, you can tell me how you enjoyed them, and we'll talk a little bit about the bean pie and the history of the bean pie in the presentation. So when I was thinking about a theme for today's presentation, I ended up deciding on looking at Black Muslims and their history of striving for self-determination. And part of the reason why I decided on that, I thought it would be good, was one, because it's a salient theme. So part of my research also looks at the history of Islam in West Africa, and we'll talk about why those two are so deeply connected. But it's a salient theme, this issue of Muslims, Black Muslims striving to obtain self-determination. And we also talked about looking at the relationship between self-determination and spiritual liberation. One of my teachers, Shaykh Sisi, he used to say Islam didn't come to oppress or enslave anybody, it came to free people. And so we wanted to come up with a theme that looked at how these sort of political and economic struggles of the communities that I study connect to a sort of Islamic imperative to achieve spiritual liberation. So I guess I want to start by asking you all a question. I'm kind of informal like that. You know, you all can holler at me from the audience if you like, and we got a nice intimate group. But when you hear this term self-determination, what do you think of? What does it bring to mind? What do you think self-determination means? Oh, come on. Is this how you are in your classes too? You must drive your professors crazy. No, I don't have any slides or anything today. I'm sorry. I messed up. Subhanallah. Well, hopefully I can compensate. I can be illustrative with my words. Yes.
So kind of like the opposite of integration, like keeping the Black community like within itself and empowering it in and of itself to kind of like a sort of intellectual, cultural, political sovereignty. Like independent from the white dominance.
That's a good one. That's a real good one. I like that. So, yeah, okay, and that's specifically in sort of the Black American context, right? Any other thoughts? I think I saw your hand. Yeah, no? Yeah. The ability and the will to choose your own path and your own goal. Like that as well. And that dovetails nicely with what she said, right? Other thoughts? Self-determination. So those are good working definitions. The history of the term, it sort of emerges from the age of the Industrial Revolution. when the globe was sort of transitioning out of an age of imperialism, or I guess more accurately into a new kind of imperialism. But the old empires were beginning to break up. And self-determination came to be sort of the, I guess, slogan of sorts for newly forming nations, as this concept we have now of a modern nation state. I know some of you may have a sense that the nation state was always with us, but it wasn't. There was a time when we didn't have the same sort of nation state structure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that hopefully at the end of why that's significant. But these new nations began to take up this call for self-determination, asserting their right to be able to sort of, pursue their own destiny. And, one of the things about the nation state and the idea of nationalism is it always sort of excludes someone, right? So if you look at the national project here, for instance, right, there were people who were already here when, the quote unquote founding fathers came and established this nation. And so this concept of nationalism excluded those folks. When Spain was established as a nation, you have people called the Basque people who were already there, indigenous to Spain, who sort of had to get excluded from this national project, right? So this is some of the sort of baggage of the terminology, but it came to be a term that oppressed people, colonized people often took up. When you had, in the age of anti-colonization, when you had formerly colonized nations gaining their independence in Africa and Asia in the 20th century, they would also take up this call for self-determination. And in the Black American context, people would take up this call for self-determination. And like, what's your name?
Mona.
Like Mona mentioned, it came to have a certain kind of resonance, right, within the Black American community, because we're not talking about a group of people who were trying to establish necessarily a geographical nation. Some folks were, but not necessarily a national project of the type that we saw emerge from Western Europe, right? So this call for self-determination came to be something that had resonance for people who felt that they were being oppressed by these new nations, or maybe we may even call them new empires, to assert their own right to be able to determine their own destiny. And one of the things that I always like to mention when I'm talking to a room full of Muslims is that it's important for you to know, if you're a Muslim in this part of the world, that African-American history is your history. Why? Because if you look at the history of Islam in this part of the world, who were the first Muslims here? Well, slaves, but they weren't always slaves. Who were they before they were slaves? Who were they before they were slaves? Did they start off as slaves? Were they born as slaves? They were West Africans, right? And many of them were Muslim. And you have these different estimations of how many of them were Muslim, and it's really hard to kind of pin down a number, and maybe we'll talk about why a little bit, but definitely a good chunk of them, some say maybe about a third of them were Muslim. But these West African people who had been enslaved and brought here against their will, the Muslims among them were the first Muslims here in large numbers. There's some theories about maybe even some Muslims who came prior to the transatlantic slave trade, but that's a little bit out of the peer review we're going to talk about today. But it's interesting stuff. Maybe we can talk about in the question and answer if y'all are really interested in it. And also, even going up to the 20th century. So we're talking about from, say, 1502, and we'll talk about why that year is important in a second, but from as early as 1502 till 1960, 1965, the vast majority of 1970, vast majority of people in this part of the world who identified as Muslim were Black American people, right? And so the people who basically laid the foundation for us to be able to identify as Muslim, wear the things we wear that sort of identifies as Muslims, assert our right to be able to practice our religion, the people who really fought for that, people who, in some cases gave their lives for that, gave a lot of effort for that, were, for the most part, African-American people. And so this is a history that all of us as Muslims in this part of the world should make ourselves aware of. So in some sense, you could say that this is a talk about Muslims' struggle to obtain self-determination in the West, in the Americas. In some sense, it's a discussion about Black Americans' struggle to obtain self-determination in the Americas. And those two stories are intertwined, they're the same story. So, and we'll talk a little bit about the sort of spiritual liberation part. I think I'll save some of that for the end as we kind of talk about what all of this means. But I'll say this. So we all know Islam speaks against oppression, talks about zulm, right? Zulm, the idea of someone, and there's all of these sort of villainous figures in the Quran who are, seen as like the sort of prototypical bad guys, and many of them are oppressors, right? People like Pharaoh is the one that, most people probably readily can identify, right? So Islam speaks against oppression, and it speaks against sort of societal oppression, as well as sort of personal oppression, right? And even a person oppressing themselves. This term zulm, also we get a word that people sometimes roughly translate as sin, that comes from the same root, right? One of our teachers, Shaykh Mohammed Izzuddin, may Allah preserve him, recently heard him give a lecture, and he was talking about the different sort of nuances of this word zulm, and how it really, part of the meaning is to put something in its improper place, to put something out of its proper place, right? And so the idea is that anytime that we give, we afford a level of devotion or a level of consideration beyond what is proper, or omit a level of devotion or consideration that is proper, this is a form of zulm. And so when we talk about spiritual liberation, the Islamic sort of paradigm with regard to liberation is that it's important to stand for justice, right? And this is a part of our, sort of Quranic inheritance, the Quranic message that we should be striving to uphold justice, and to establish societies that are based on justice and that allow for the spiritual cultivation and healthy spiritual life of the individuals in that society. And also, on a personal level, there's an imam in Harlem named Imam Talib Abdul Rashid, who is a real great resource and expert on the history of Islam in this part of the world, and one of my teachers in the subject. He always says that, Islam, Islam is built on servitude to God, and if you don't have servitude to God, then you spend your life serving Anonymous, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, Sex Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. So this idea is that in order to truly achieve spiritual liberation, a person has to sort of free themselves. Spiritual liberation in our sort of Islamic context or paradigm doesn't just mean sort of the freedom to just pursue pleasure, right? At the expense of someone else or at the expense of your own well-being, right? We're not talking about a hedonistic kind of freedom when we talk about establishing freedom and liberation. And I don't want to go off on any more of a tangent in terms of that, but we'll get back to that and why that's significant in terms of our paradigm of Muslims seeking self-determination, with some of the examples that we're going to get into. So, as we've mentioned, the first Muslims in this part of the world we mentioned were enslaved West African Muslims, right? And so you can't really talk about Muslim history in America or African-American history without talking a little bit about West African history, right? Because who are these people? And there's a debate in the field, and some of my folks are here, but there's been this long-standing sort of, I guess, debate among scholars of African-American history of, to what extent did Black American people preserve some of their Africanness, right? So some folks said, Black American people were sort of a tabula rasa, like a blank slate. Just, they were brought here to the West, and they just, whatever they brought with them just sort of disappeared. Slavery just sort of, took away from them their humanity, their culture, their ideas about the world. And then there's another sort of line of thinking that stresses this idea of African retentions, that, if we look at African-American people, we can see all of these different cultural retentions that point to like these aspects of their African identity that they're held on to. And now, at this point in the field, I think it's pretty much agreed upon that neither one is really wholly right. The models that people use are what we call creolization or hybridization. Basically, that the people who were brought here from West Africa, they of course were people, were human beings. They came with their ideas, they came with their cultures, they came with their way of engaging the world. And then in this context of the New World, quote unquote, as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, they were forced to adapt. And so some of those things changed. They were influenced by and in conversation with the other people that they encountered here in this part of the world. So So in order to understand the types of strategies that these people embraced, right, or undertook, it's important to understand something about where they came from. And I'm going to resist my impulse to make this a long lecture about the history of Islam in West Africa, because it's a subject that I'm really interested in and that I do study. But I'm going to try not to spend too much time talking about that. But I do think that there are some basic things that we need to know about the nature of West African societies, in particular Muslim West African societies, to help us understand the kind of strategies to obtain self-determination that their descendants are engaging in this part of the world. So in Sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, you have a long history of a sort of presence of Muslim people that goes back to, say, about the 9th century, 10th century, so pretty early on. And in the early stages, you had Muslims who had their own towns, their own communities. Often they were immigrant communities who set up their own sort of spaces in these West African societies that were not majority Muslim, that were not ruled by Muslims, not governed by Muslims, and not majority Muslim. Some people have made the analogy the way we think about a Chinatown, right? So you had these towns in West Africa of Muslim traders who came and engaged in trade, and they had a place in society, but they didn't seek to sort of overturn society or anything like that. And gradually over time, many of the indigenous people began to embrace the religion. Sometimes it was a top-down situation where kings or rulers or leaders of societies would embrace the religion. And then sometimes it was sort of a more bottom-up process where people on the ground just were compelled by the religion as they encountered it. And you had eventually the emergence of what we generally call empires. I'm sometimes hesitant to use certain terminology and sort of superimpose a sort of Western Eurocentric paradigm on societies that operated according to a very different logic. But as a shorthand, we'll say empires, right? These West African Muslim empires emerged. You have the Mali Empire, which emerges in sort of the early half of the 13th century and goes on until about 1600. And then after that, you have its sort of successor, the Songhai Empire, which emerges around the middle of the 15th century on until about the end of the 16th century. And in these empires, you had clerical cities, right? And this is a very important point to note when you're looking at the history of Islam in West Africa. The Islam in West Africa is really spread in the pre-colonial period by clerics, by clerical lineages, not by force and not so much by even rulers, right? Because these are societies that are very pluralistic. There's a lot of religious diversity, a lot of religious pluralism. And for the most part, the folks in West Africa, the way that Muslims tended to attempt to spread their religion was through education, was through being a benefit to the society, right? So Muslims had been able to develop these trading networks. And there's a really good book called On Trans-Saharan Trails by, what's the author's name? How do you say her first name? Ghislaine, I always say her name wrong. Ghislaine Leiden. And it's a really good book. It's a pretty thick book, but it's a good book if you're interested in learning more. She talks about how there's this notion when we think about Sub-Saharan Africa, right? We think about the Sahara as this big empty void that just separates North Africa and South Africa, and the two never really meet. And one of the things she does in this book is to really kind of debunk that and show us that no, actually the Sahara for a long time is this bustling space where folks are engaged in cultural exchange, intellectual exchange, and economic exchange. So you have these trading diasporas and these diasporas of knowledge that sort of connect Muslims in West Africa throughout the region to North Africa and beyond. And so you have a situation where you have the emergence of these clerical lineages that establish clerical cities or clerical towns where they have a degree of autonomy, right? They have a degree of autonomy, whether the ruler is Muslim. Sometimes you might have a ruler who's Muslim who is sort of a patron of these cities. Sometimes you have a ruler who's not Muslim, but who sees the city as a benefit to the society because of the role it plays in facilitating trade and intellectual exchange and intellectual development. And sometimes you have nominally Muslim rulers who become Muslim, but don't necessarily implement, the kinds of reforms, for lack of a better word, that maybe the Muslim clerics would like to see, but they still embrace, at least the veneer of Islam. And in these cases, often they allow for the emergence of these cities, these centers, to thrive, that are Islamic centers under their care. And these cities are places where there's a degree of sort of self-governance, right? So one of the earliest cases of these cities is a city called Jaba in what is today Mali, in part of what is today Mali, in the around the Niger Delta. And the city is referred to in one of the older chronicles that we have of the regions, a book called Tariq al-Fatash. It's referred to as the city of God, right? A city of God, meaning it's a city where the religious scholars have a degree of reign over what happens in the city. The city that you all probably heard of is Timbuktu, famous city of the same sort, where, as the story goes, from what we have in the chronicles, if a person was convicted of a crime or suspected of a crime, and they managed to get to Timbuktu, and they got some of the clerics in Timbuktu to vouch for them, the ruler would leave them be, right? So imagine that, there's somebody who is, on the most wanted list here in the States, and they get to some religious center, and the religious people say, no, we think he's all right or she's all right, and suddenly the state says, okay, we're gonna let him go. Very different kind of paradigm, right? But this is something that you see in West Africa. And you have a lot of cities like this that develop during this pre-colonial period. I'll mention one because it factors into some of the stories we're gonna hear about on the other side of the Atlantic. In Senegal, there's one important city of this sort called Pire, right? And Pire is a city that's known for Islamic learning. It produces, among many, it produces two very important religious leaders from the pre-colonial period. One is a man named Malik Sy. Malik Sy founds a similar town called Bundu in the year 1699. Another is Al-Mami Qadr Khan, Abdul Qadir Khan. Abdul Qadir Khan is involved in an Islamic revolution that takes place in the area of Futa Toro, which is around the area of what is present-day Guinea, Senegal, around the border. And that revolution takes place in 1776. So these are important people because they're going to have some resonance, or their movements have some impact on what people are doing on the other side of the Atlantic. And just before the colonial period, you have another such city, or you begin to have a shift, right? And a good friend of mine named Dr. Rudolph Ware, who just wrote a book called The Walking Quran, talks about this. It's a really great book. But he talks about how something begins to shift during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, where prior to this time, you have all of these clerics, these clerical cities. Their stance is essentially a non-violent sort of engagement with society. They do engage, and you have a really important figure named Al-Hajj Abdul Salim Souri, who is credited as being sort of the archetypical sort of scholar, who's sort of the father of this tradition, where you have these Muslim clerics who, the way they engage society, the kind of jihad, that big scary J word, the kind of jihad that they engage in is the jihad of the pen. Basically, they don't see it as their place to completely distance themselves from society, but they attempt to engage society and better society through their writings, through their teachings, through promoting literacy, not by any sort of violent engagement to take over the state. In fact, they're very pronounced in their writings that they don't support any sort of violent engagement of that type. But there begins to be a shift during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, where suddenly you have all these clerics who begin to engage in violent revolution, violent movements to be able to establish Islamic societies. And the argument that Dr. Ware makes, and actually it's an argument that also an important theorist, historian named Walter Rodney, who, if you don't know, you should jot his name down, you should know. He talks about in his work as well, about how the transatlantic slave trade causes some serious changes in the kinds of relationships that West African rulers have with the people that they're governing, right? Where suddenly you begin to have a class of rulers who have a more predatory relationship to their subjects, right? And for the sake of time, I won't go into too much detail, with the sort of mechanics of that, but I will say part of what begins to happen is you have this new class of leaders who see in slavery an opportunity to obtain luxury goods, an opportunity to obtain firearms, to expand their empires, and an opportunity to police people in a different kind of way. You have slavery exists in West Africa like it does in most pre-modern societies. And, slavery is not a condition that most people would ask to be in. So we're not making no claims about, slavery in West Africa being like great and lovely or anything like that. But it was certainly different. And part of that difference had to do with the fact that there was a greater degree of social mobility. Being held in the condition of enslavement didn't mean that you were relegated to that for perpetuity, your generations and the generations that followed. And when you look at the history of West Africa, you see there are a lot of cases of migration, right? People don't have necessarily the same concept of their identity as being tied to their geography in the way that we see in the sort of Western concept of a nation state, right? So this is why you have, when people use this term tribe, right? When you think of West Africa, you think of tribes. Tribe can, is some sort of a loaded, problematic term, right? In a lot of ways. But one thing that I think it does help us get to is the fact that people's sense of identity, of communal identity, isn't tied specifically to being in one geography, right? So we have this town I mentioned, Jah, right? And you have the Jahanke, which is a clerical lineage of Muslim scholars that emerges from this place and that goes and creates different towns, right, based on the model of the town where their sort of societal identity formed, right, that have similar names. Jaba, Jaka, things like this. Jaka in Messina, Jaka in Bambuku, different areas in West Africa. So if you can imagine, the same way that here in this part of the world, when people tried to enslave Native Americans, often they did what? They ran away. They knew the terrain. They were able to go somewhere else. You had similar kinds of dynamics at work in West Africa. But slavery in the context of the transatlantic slave trade becomes a way to police people in a different kind of way. Because now if you oppose my reign, I can kidnap you and sell you behind and send you somewhere where we'll never see you again, right? So slavery changes the relationship of some African rulers to the people that they govern. And as a result, you find that many of these clerical lineages and Muslim clerics in the region, they begin to take up arms, right? And some of the sort of notable revolutions that come about in that era are the Sokoto Caliphate, established by Sheikh Uthman Anfodio in the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And he's important. Remember that name because we're going to talk about him a little bit later again. You have, we already talked about Imam Abdul Qadir Khan, who facilitates the revolution, that Dr. Ware points out is explicitly, partially motivated by or facilitates an abolitionist movement in the region, which is kind of a revolutionary idea because for a long time in African history, we thought that, or people thought, I didn't think, but people thought that, abolition was something that kind of came from the West and that, people of color, African folks, Muslim folks, brown folks, they never thought about abolishing slavery. That was something that we got from, folks in the West who had a different kind of perception of human rights. And one of the things that he does in his book is really kind of debunk that and give us one of the many examples of people in other parts of the world who actually did mount abolitionist movements in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. And then later there's another figure who really just on the eve of colonization, you have Sheikh Umar Futi, who emerges from the area of what is today Senegal and tries to establish an Islamic society that covers parts of what is today Guinea, parts of what is today Senegal, parts of what is today Mali. So a really big undertaking. So now I want to shift a little bit. And now that we know something about the kinds of societies that folks are being taken from on the West African continent, we can analyze a little bit better some of the strategies for self-determination that folks take on this side of the continent. So, so have you all heard the term maroon before? You know what maroons are? Maroons, this is a new concept. Okay, so maroon is a term that we think probably comes from the word Cimarron, and I'm probably butchering it, but it means untamed or wild, and it's a name that was given to runaways, right? Runaway slaves. And so we have, in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, many cases, particularly in the Caribbean and South America, but also in North America as well, of enslaved peoples who respond to their enslaved condition by running away and establishing these alternative societies. Another good friend of mine, Imam Mohammed Mendes, who is a religious scholar based in Atlanta, who comes to Philly from time to time. So you guys should keep your ears open. Ustada knows him pretty well. But I heard him give a lecture, and he says, in African-American sort of popular history, we have this sort of trope or this concept of the house nigga, right, or the house slave, and the field slave, right? And the house slave is the slave who's in the house, who is sort of, to use your word, Mona, right, sort of assimilated or sort of, co-opted, who's sort of assisting the master, right, the slave master, and then the field slave, the one who's out in the field, the one who's subjugated and made to do the brunt of the hard labor. But we don't talk about this third category of the person who ran away, right, and did something different somewhere else up off the plantation. And this is what we mean when we talk about maroons. And the first maroons that I know of, so now that you all know what a maroon is, right? The first maroons that I know of, and this is not to say that the first maroons that exist, but the first maroons that I know of actually date back, and as a Muslim, this is a history that I'm interested in, date back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him. Does anybody know this story? Know about the first Muslim maroons? Anybody know about the first Muslim maroons? So you guys know about the Hijra, right? The Hijra, where the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, took some of his people or took his followers and they migrated from Mecca to Medina, right? But in the process of this movement that our Prophet, praise and peace be upon him, was mounting, he entered into a famous treaty. Everybody know the name of the treaty with the Meccans? Hudaybiyah, right. And so one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah that the Prophet, praise and peace be upon him, entered in with the Meccans is that anybody who came to Medina, right? Anybody who came to Medina from Mecca, any refugees, the Muslims would send them back to Mecca. And this was obviously something that was a concession that the Muslims didn't like to have to make, but they felt that the Prophet, praise and peace be upon him, felt that it was paramount to establish this treaty to begin to establish Medina, right, and maintain its security. So anybody escaped from Mecca, we'll send them back to the people that are oppressing us over there in Mecca. But anybody who runs from Medina to Mecca, you don't have to send them back. You can keep them, right? And so there were people who did run away from Mecca and came to Medina. And these people, or at least there were some cases, I don't know if these were all the people who escaped from Mecca to Medina, but certainly there were some people who escaped from Mecca to Medina that the Prophet, praise and peace be upon him, sent back. He sent back to Mecca. And they, on the way to Mecca, as they were being taken to Mecca, they escaped from the people who were trying to escort them back to Mecca, and they established their own enclave somewhere on the road between Mecca and Medina. It started off as 1 and then 3, and then I think it grew to be a few more. And they had their own sort of situation, off the road, off the beaten path, off the road from Mecca to Medina. And whenever the Meccan caravans would pass by that road, they would raid it. They would steal from the caravans of the people who oppressed them and caused them to have to go into exile in order to sustain themselves. And they wreaked so much havoc on these caravans that finally the people of Mecca said, take them. We don't want to have to deal with this. You can take them back to Medina, right? So this was the first such instance from our tradition of people who undertook this kind of approach to establishing self-determination, right? So we fast forward to 1502. Remember I told you that year was going to be important. So there's a really good book called Maroon Societies. It's sort of the first synthetic study of maroon societies in the Americas. It was edited by a guy named Richard Price, I believe is his name. And it opens up on the very first page. It talks about how in 1502, there was a governor. What is the governor's name? Governor Ovando, right? From Spain. He's bound on a ship, on a fleet, bound for Hispaniola, right? What is today the island where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are. And he's basically going to revive the colony that Columbus left behind after his first journey 10 years earlier, right? And he has some enslaved Africans on that ship. And one of the enslaved Africans on that ship runs away. The way I think it says he ran away, he escaped to the Indians, right? So from the very beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, you find that one of the strategies that people are taking up is marriage, marooning. They leave. They go, they form societies with the Native American peoples often, and they are able to eke out some kind of existence for themselves in that way. And in the early days of the transatlantic slave trade, the bulk of the folks who were enslaved are actually coming from the Jollof Empire, which is what is today's Senegal. So many of them were Muslim, right? This is in the very beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Before the transatlantic slave trade really begins to establish itself in North America, in what is today the U.S. So this, we're talking about more so the Caribbean, South America. We're talking about Spanish colonies, right? And they begin to develop a reputation, many of the folks enslaved, particularly from Muslim societies, they develop a reputation for rebelliousness, for running away, and for even in some cases you find they build alliances with Native Americans, and Native Americans begin to become Muslim. You know, we have all of this stuff happening, such that by the time slavery becomes established in North America, there is a move to find slaves from a different part of the continent, right? And so you find a lot of the early slaves in North America, they come from further south in what is today Congo, what is today Angola, this area of the continent. But still, over time, you find, you know, a number of Muslims make their way to North America as well, because, you know, in the Carolinas, it becomes advantageous to bring folks who are familiar with rice cultivation, and many of them are from places that you have Muslims. And also because throughout the transatlantic slave trade, you have a large number of slaves in North America that are actually brought from the Caribbean, right? And in the Caribbean, you find there's this very long and healthy tradition of maroon societies and folks going off and doing their own thing in this way, and many of those people are Muslim. And I wanted to kind of give a couple examples of some prominent enslaved Muslims, but I'm looking at time, and I do want to get to one more part of the presentation, but I do want to talk a little bit about this. So one of the sort of salient features among Muslims who are enslaved in the Americas is this sort of, and this is not by any means only a character that you find among the Muslims, but at no time during the transatlantic slave trade do you not find Africans rebelling. At all times in the transatlantic slave trade, you find people engaged in revolt, violent revolt, armed revolt, passive resistance, marooning, all these kinds of things. Assalamu alaikum. And this is a hallmark of the transatlantic slave trade. And so you find certain important, prominent cases of resistance that Muslims play a prominent role in. So one happens in Brazil. This happens in the 1800s in a place called Bahia. It's known as the Malay slave revolt. It's the largest attempted slave revolt in the West during the time. And some of the folks who facilitate the revolt are actually inspired by the movement of Shaykh Uthman Dan Fodio, who we mentioned earlier, right? So this is one of several examples that we can note of folks who are actually inspired by and influenced by. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming. Alhamdulillah. So this is one of the many examples we can cite of folks who are actually inspired by what's happening on the continent, and it's actually informing the ways they try to resist here in the West. And Bahia, you know, sometimes it's talked about as a sort of failure, right? Because the Muslims don't actually, and some people say it was actually a Muslim jihad in Bahia. Other people say, no, it wasn't a Muslim jihad, it was just some Muslims who were revolting. But whatever the case, it results in a number of enslaved African Muslims being sent back, right? And this is not a revolutionary movement that is participated in just by Muslims, right? And this, again, sort of mirrors some of the things that we're seeing on the African continent, where you have, in this context of religious pluralism, a different kind of exchange, right? So another really important example, and a really great example, is the Haitian Revolution. right? The Haitian Revolution. So in the Haitian Revolution, we have a lot of literature about the Haitian Revolution. Books have been written about the Haitian Revolution. And most of the literature about the Haitian Revolution discusses the way that that African identity and traditional African spirituality played a prominent role in the Haitian Revolution. But what for a long time wasn't discussed was the fact that some aspect of what was identified as sort of African traditional religion was actually Islam. And this is something that we find common in the literature of the slave trade. You'll find things like, you'll find people talk about in the literature, things like fetishes, right? Things like amulets and charms that enslaved African peoples used as a source of strength, as a source of protection, right? And when historians went back and actually, looked at the contents of some of these fetishes, quote unquote, we find Arabic writings, we find verses from the Quran, right? In the case of the Haitian Revolution, we have two very important, very prominent figures who play an important role in sort of setting the stage for the Haitian Revolution. One is named Macandal, right? Francois Macandal. The other is Boukman, Betty Boukman. So these two people, you find in literature on the Haitian Revolution, they talked about a lot. Macandal is actually a Maroon, right? He develops, he works on a plantation. He's skilled like many slaves. He's skilled. He's not just a field worker. And he ends up in an accident losing his hand, right? Sometime thereafter, he leaves, he runs away, and he establishes a society in Haiti, right? During slavery, he establishes his own sort of enclave up in the mountains. And from that enclave, from that position, he's known to come down and wreak havoc on plantations and destroy property and help people that want to become free. And he actually articulates a vision for the future of Haiti. There's a scene where he is said to have called some of the Haitian folks and did this sort of presentation where he had 3 handkerchiefs. And he had a white handkerchief, a yellow handkerchief, and a black handkerchief, right? So this is before the Haitian Revolution, but this is to make the point that this was not just a person who saw himself as just resisting. He saw himself as inciting a greater revolutionary movement. So he holds up the yellow handkerchief and he says, this represents the people who were initially on the island, right? The indigenous people, Native American people, right? And then he holds up the white handkerchief and says, this represents the people who are in control of the island now. And then he holds up the black handkerchief and says, this are the people who are going to take over and be in charge from until the end of time, right? So he is one of the people who sort of incites this revolutionary movement. And when we look at the history, there's a great book called Servants of Allah by Sylviane Diouf, historian. She talks about, specifically about, this book is about enslaved Muslims, enslaved West African Muslims, and their sojourn, their experience all throughout the Americas. And she makes a really compelling case. At one point it was kind of speculative, but at this point we have enough evidence that we can kind of say with some conviction, Macandal was most likely a Muslim, and not only a Muslim, but a Muslim probably from one of these clerical lineages, right? Because he had access to Islamic education, he was literate, he was known to create prayers, amulets, things like this that people use for protection and people used in their efforts to resist the oppressive regime of the slave economy in Haiti. Another was Boukman. Boukman was a slave who came to Haiti from Jamaica. And what we think now is that the reason why he had the name Boukman is because he was a man of the book. This was a term that people used for someone who either had a Quran or maybe memorized the entire Quran. And similarly, he's one of these figures who sort of incites and foments revolution in the context of Haiti. He's seen as a martyr who helps to sort of inspire the Haitian Revolution that comes shortly after him. So those are just a couple of cases. There are more cases we could cite. On the American continent, I do want to say this, on the North American continent, you have a very interesting example in Florida, Spanish Florida. And my advisor, her name is Mary Frances Berry, who is a really impressive, dynamic woman, scholar. You all should know her. If you don't, I could, talk a lot about my advisor. I think she's great. But she wrote a book called Black Resistance, White Law. Black Resistance, White Law. It's a classic. You should go out and get it. I already told you that if you're Muslim, African-American history is your history, so you should go out and read that book because it's a part of your history. And she talks about Spanish Florida. And one of the things that we see when Florida is a Spanish colony is that it becomes a space where enslaved Africans and Native American people are able to establish their own sort of semi-autonomous settlement. In fact, when the state of Georgia is established, it's established without slavery. Slavery is initially not in Georgia. And the reason is because it's imagined that it can be a buffer between the slave state of South Carolina and the state of Florida, where where Africans could run away and establish themselves along with the Native Americans. And also, when I mentioned the root of this term maroon, some people also say that this is also the root, this Cimarron is also the root of the term Seminole. Anybody know who the Seminoles were? Oh, football fans, right? That's jacked up, right? So what's a Seminole? Right. But, Ta'ala. Right. But there is, these people that are known as Seminoles, Native Americans, like I said, this term, some people think it actually even comes from a term which means runaway, right? So it really is a sort of confederation of different Native American and African peoples who decide that they don't want to have anything to do with this, slave economy, white supremacist structure that permeates America at this time on the eve of American independence. And they go and establish, and even after American independence, actually, and they establish themselves in Florida, right? And so the Native Americans who are seen as leaders of this confederation of Seminoles, right, as they negotiate with the representatives of the U.S. government, they are unwilling to give up all of these West African folks who have run away and joined their ranks, right? So it's this beautiful story of solidarity between these peoples, and we know from things like the fact that there's a place a couple miles, I think, away from St. Augustine, Florida, known as Fort Musa, right? Fort Musa. Fort Musa was named by these enslaved Africans, formerly enslaved Africans and Native Americans. They name it, and there's these different sort of allusions, these sort of historical clues that let us know that there was certainly a significant number of Muslims around them, like things like Tallahassee, right? Certain terms that scholars believe actually will probably derive from Arabic words that West African folks there would have brought with them, right? And the thing about Florida is Florida violently resists, right? Up until the end, until finally, and the sort of global geopolitics where, you have Spain and American interest and British interest clashing, and these folks are able to take advantage of that context to establish themselves in Florida with some degree of protection because it's a Spanish colony. But ultimately, when Spain leaves and no longer has control of the colony, Andrew Jackson comes, our great president, not my president. He comes and basically razes these settlements to the ground. So this is just one example on the North American continent, right, of folks who are engaged in this kind of strategy of self-determination. And the reason I started by talking about what's happening in West Africa is, one, because you have these sort of connections, like I mentioned Bundu, established by a man named Malik Sy, one of the folks enslaved, one of the famous folks enslaved and brought to North America is a descendant from the founder, from Malik Sy. I believe I think it's Ayuba bin Suleiman. Is he the one who was descended from Malik Sy? Do you remember? Okay. He studied in Bundu. I believe he was also, they say he was like the grandson or great grandson of Malik Sy. That's what they say. That might have been the oral narrative, right? But so you have these sort of connections, right, where folks here are actually being inspired by what they saw happening on the ground in West Africa, where you have these Muslim societies that are engaged in these different violent struggles to create societies that are able to exist in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, where they're protected, where they can pursue their own vision as Muslims of what society is supposed to look like, right? You find that is also sort of impacting what's happening in this part of the world. And there's a lot more I can say about that. There's a lot more I want to say about that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of move on. And so in the literature about enslaved West African Muslims, right, we find that there's this period, this very kind of brief period, maybe 30 to 50 years, in basically the second half of the 19th century, where, you know, we had all of this stuff before that, all of these different descriptions of enslaved African people practicing Islam and struggling to be able to hold on to their Islam in the Caribbean, in the Americas. Sometimes they are able to, as Sylviane Diouf terms it, they're able to sort of, how does she put it? They're able to sort of reach the top of the slave system, right? So one really interesting case is Sapelo Island. Sapelo, and I hope some of y'all, if y'all are, you know, in tune with stuff happening on campus, you've heard of Sapelo. So Sapelo Island is an island off the coast of Georgia, where enslaved African Muslims were able to maintain a degree of autonomy. This is a very rare sort of story where this group of West African Muslims on this small island, or this group of West Africans, Muslim and non-Muslim, on this small island, had a slave owner who was a little more benign than usual, or a lot more benign than usual. And for him, it was not so convenient for him to really occupy that space, right, on the island all the time. So he allowed these enslaved folks, or maybe he wasn't so benign, maybe he was just smart, right? But he allowed the enslaved folks on that island to have a degree of self-government. During the War of 1812, he left with his family to the mainland and actually armed some of the enslaved folks there to protect the borders, and they protected the borders. And they were able to build a mosque. One of the leaders of this community was named Balali Muhammad. He actually wrote a fiqh text, a sort of jurisprudential sacred law text based on the Maliki Madhab, the Maliki school of thought, in, I believe it was Fulbe. And at first, when people saw this fiqh text that he wrote so that his descendants and the people in his community could maintain their religion, people said, this is written in Arabic, but we don't understand it, it's gibberish. You know, some Islamic scholars saw it and said, oh, this was written by a jinn or something, this is gibberish. What we now know was actually written in one of the West African languages, I believe Fulbe, in Arabic script, which is very common. There's this term Ajami script, right? Folks who have their indigenous languages and write them in Arabic characters, right? So this was how this text was written, like phonetic, exactly. And we find this all throughout the Muslim world, right? This happens in Turkey, this happens in Persia, you know. So it's not weird that it happens in West Africa. What's weird is that people just assume that West Africans wouldn't know to do it like everybody else did. But you have this tradition of literacy, which becomes a way that enslaved African Muslims are able to resist, are able to seek some degree of self-determination in the context of the transatlantic slave trade. So then we have this period. We have all these stories before this period, in sort of the middle of the 19th century, where we hear all these stories about enslaved Africans practicing their religion in North America, in the Caribbean. And then suddenly, in North America at least, the stories kind of die out. We don't really hear anything about Muslims. And there's different theories. Some people say that it's because there were no more. The Muslims basically failed. The West African Muslims basically failed in trying to preserve their Islamic identity and sort of pass their ideals on to you know, successive generations. Some people think that, you know, what happens is Muslims begin to sort of practice their religion in secret, because in most cases you can't really practice your religion in the context of the transatlantic slave trade unless your religion is Christianity, right? If you practice Islam or any African traditional religion, it's met with violence, right? It's met with violent consequences. So some people say, okay, the Muslims were still there, but they just sort of hid, you know. One theory is even that, you know, it's sort of, Islam begins to hide itself in sort of just after the abolition of slavery, when Black American people begin to develop their own institutions. One of the institutions that becomes important are Freemasonic institutions. And in Freemasonry, there is a space to sort of dabble in a different kind of ecumenical study of different religions, right? So some people think maybe the Muslims kind of hid in these Freemasonic orders, right? In Jamaica, you have a church called the Moravian Church, right? That a number of prominent West African Muslims in Jamaica are a part of. Abu Bakr Siddiq is one, and some others. They're connected to this church. This church also becomes, the church also ends up sponsoring some of the work of Edward Wilmot Blyden, right? Who's an important Pan-Africanist who goes to West Africa, spends some time in West Africa, comes away as a missionary, but comes away with a very sort of positive ideal about Islam. Some people think maybe he became Muslim. Some people think maybe he didn't become Muslim, but he just said, you know, Islam has a relationship to black people that is better than a relationship Christianity has to black people. So if we want to missionize and bring people to Christianity, maybe we should take notes, right? But whatever, and he becomes an important sort of influential figure for black American folks in the 20th century who begin to embrace Islam, right? So he has a connection to this church too. So maybe it sort of hides itself in churches that are a little bit more amenable to African folks practicing their indigenous religious traditions. Maybe it hides itself in Freemasonry. Maybe it dies out. I personally don't think it dies out because I just don't think history works that way. But shortly thereafter, after the turn of the 20th century, you have the emergence of several different communities and groups of black American people sort of reasserting an Islamic identity, right? And the first sort of really big one that gains a lot of traction and becomes very popular is the Moorish Science Temple, right? Established in 1913 by a man named Noble Drew Ali, right? And the Moorish Science Temple, as far back as 1929, begins to explore the possibility of creating towns that are, quote, completely owned and operated by members of the Moorish Science Temple, right? So they're sort of picking right up where, you know, the folks who are engaged in marooning, right, left off. And they say, okay, we just need to kind of separate ourselves and have our own communities, right? But it becomes and the other thing about the Moorish Science Temple, it is, and I should say this for folks who may not know, the Moorish Science Temple is an organization that promotes a kind of Islamic identity, but also promotes some practices and beliefs that are very much at odds with sort of orthodox notions of Islam, right? So their founder, Noble Drew Ali, he's considered to be a prophet, you know. At the time, it doesn't really seem that folks in the Moorish Science Temple are necessarily engaged in sort of the rudimentary fundamentals of Islam, like praying 5 times a day and fasting during Ramadan, things like this. But it's also important to note that the Moorish Science Temple in particular is an organization that in its early days is sort of trying to figure out what it looks like, right? So you have a lot of different types of people, some of whom, as we look into oral history, and that's what I focus on as you look at the oral narrative, some of whom do seem to have some type of memory of an Islamic identity. People were saying, oh yeah, our people were Muslim, you know, but don't necessarily have genealogies where they can trace themselves to Muslim communities from, you know, sub-Saharan Africa or even the Americas during the era of slavery. But people have some kind of notion that their people are Muslim, right? Their ancestors are Muslim among black Americans, are among the people attracted to the Moorish Science Temple. And there are different sort of approaches to Islamic practice and Islamic identity that exist in the early days of the Moorish Science Temple. Like many religious organizations, right? Like before things get codified, you have a lot of different ideas, right? Yeah. So the Moorish Science Temple is founded in Newark, New Jersey. And there's a whole another sort of rabbit hole, you know, because there's a precursor organization that we used to not know anything about that now we're starting to learn about that existed in Newark, New Jersey, that's led some people to think that maybe the Moorish Science Temple wasn't founded in Newark, New Jersey, but rather Noble Drew Ali maybe was influenced by a pre-existing similar organization of black American folks who had an affinity for Islam or engaged in some kind of Islamic practice. But the Moorish Science Temple itself gets big in the 1920s in Chicago, right? And the Moorish Science Temple begins to build a significant presence in certain urban cities in the Midwest and on the East Coast in the 20s and in the 30s. And while there is a sort of interest in building autonomous communities, in the 1940s, the Moorish Science Temple even acquires farmland, right, to do some farming and try to be self-sufficient, self-subsisting. You have in these urban spaces the development of strategies to obtain as much autonomy and self-determination from a political economic perspective as possible. So you have cooperative economics. The Moorish Science Temple creates its own businesses with all these different healthcare and self-care products, right? It becomes like this large network of folks who are sort of bound together by not only this sense of their own Islamic and Moorish identity, right? And the idea is that, so in some ways, it's probably even offensive for me to say the Moorish Science Temple is a black American organization, right? Because folks in the Moorish Science Temple will say that blackness is a construct that's been imposed on folks and that it really doesn't have any meaning, and that sort of part of the appeal of the Moorish Science Temple is that folks in the Moorish Science Temple are saying, no, we need to actually reclaim some kind of tangible identity grounded in a history. And for them, the history that is most sort of compelling is this history of what we call Moors, right? So the people of North and West Africa, right? These Muslim societies in North and West Africa whose ancestors were among the people who went and conquered Spain in 711 and ruled Spain for almost 800 years, right? So that's a whole nother history. So this sort of shared cultural identity and a sort of rejection of a sort of limited historical narrative that says that, you know, black, quote unquote, black people's history starts with slavery, as well as a tangible program to actually achieve some self-determination, some political economic autonomy, right? So that's one example. Another example, so in 1929, you have a member of the Moorish Science Temple who's a leader of the Moorish Science Temple, who goes by the name of Lomax Bey. At some point, he changes his name to Muhammad Ali Bey. He's the leader of the Moorish Science Temple in Detroit. And my good friend Akil Fad, who's an independent historian in his own right, you know, who's from Detroit, who's done some history on the ground there. And, you know, what he sort of unearthed is that it seems that while he is the head of the Moorish Science Temple in Detroit, he actually encounters what's left of a community of mostly Turkish Muslims that is at once led by Dous Muhammad Ali. Dous Muhammad Ali, who we don't have time to talk too much about, but who is this important Pan-African figure who's sort of a mentor to Marcus Garvey, who at one time spends time in America, in Detroit and in Harlem, and he's helping to organize different communities of color, right? Turkish folks, East African folks, Arab folks, African-American folks, who are around issues of labor, right? So he's a laborer. And we have a couple other figures. There's a figure in Harlem named Sufi Abdul Hamid, who actually, I believe, starts off in Chicago before he goes to New York. And he also is a prominent Black American Muslim labor organizer, right? So I'm going to talk about this hopefully in a little bit in my sort of final comments about this link between labor, people of color, people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, and how this early history of Islam in the 20th century is sort of embedded in that history. We have our prominent figures are all engaged in these different struggles for disempowered people to achieve self-determination, right? So Muhammad Ali Bey, he goes to Detroit, he encounters this community, he ends up embracing what we might call Orthodox Islam or Sunni Islam, and he goes to Turkey, and he tries to get Turkey to put up some land for Black American people who want to repatriate and want to completely sort of the ultimate maroon move, right? Hijra to another part of the world where they can establish their own Muslim society and be autonomous and live the way they want to live. Turkey's going through its own sort of nationalist project, and, you know, people who represent the Turkish government kind of look at them confused, like, I don't really know why you would want to come here. You know, you may imagine that this is a part of your own sort of Islamic people of color diaspora, but we don't really see it that way. But it's okay. You can stay here, but you might want to go to Egypt, right? So he goes to Egypt. Spends about 5 years in Egypt studying. So whenever you hear narratives about, you know, folks from this part of the world, from the West, going over to study and learn Islam in the Muslim world, you know, people, I was once in Jordan, and I asked a friend of mine, you know, because he kept talking about one particular white American Muslim scholar as being like one of the first who went and studied. And I said, well, you know, he's not really the first, right? He says, no, he's the first. These guys are the first. And I said, when did he go study? You know, 60s, 70s, you know, 70s, 90s. So, well, you know, there's somebody who studied in 1930 in Egypt for 5 years. And he looked at me, you know, dumbfounded, because this history isn't known as much, right? Because it is our Muslim history that is a part of our African-American history, and that's the history that doesn't get talked about and celebrated as much, right? So, but you all are here, so you are exceptions to that rule, because now you know about this man, Muhammad Ali Bey, who goes and he changes his name to Professor Mohammed Izzuddin. Like, I met a young woman today named Izzati, and I told her that we were going to talk about Mohammed Izzuddin, and people call him Izzuddin, right? Like people sometimes call you, I think you said Izzati, right? Yeah, Izzati. So people call him Izzuddin, or Izzuddin is Izzuddin, right? And his story is its own phenomenal story and its own phenomenal journey. But he comes back to the U.S. He becomes a mentor and an influence for a number of Black American Sunni Muslim communities that emerged on the East Coast and the Midwest. And similarly, you know, he's involved in these attempts initially to form enclaves, communities, sort of outside of the city. One he establishes, or some of his students established, right outside of Buffalo, New York, called Jebel Arabia. Another one he establishes called Izzuddin Village, very close to here in South Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia. And this is all in the late 1930s, right? Another early African-American Sunni Muslim or Orthodox Muslim figure who figures particularly prominently in my research focusing on New York is a man named Shaykh Daoud Ahmed Faisal, and his wife, Mother Khadijah Faisal. They are sort of looming figures in the early history of Islam in New York City in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and on to about 1980 when they pass away. Sheikh Daoud may have also been sort of influenced by Professor Izzuddin, because Professor Izzuddin, Mohammed Izzuddin, one of the things he tries to do is he tries to bring all of these different pockets of Black American Sunni Muslims together under some kind of unifying organization. They actually have a conference in the 1940s right here in Philadelphia called the Unifying Islamic Societies Conference that brings folks from Cleveland, folks from here in Philly, folks from New York, New Jersey, all these different areas together to meet. And so they're all in conversation with each other. But Sheikh Daoud also engages in a similar project. He establishes or tries to establish a community in Fishkill, which is like a rural area in New York State in 1934 called Medina Salam. So all of these communities are seeking to sort of go off the grid, as we might say, and establish their own communities. But ultimately, they all settle on a different kind of strategy. Right, they all settle on a strategy where they sort of double down in the urban centers where they live in New York City, in Philadelphia, in Newark, New Jersey, in Chicago, right, and begin to develop a strategy based on cooperative economics, building their own businesses, building their own schools, right, and coupling that with a kind of cultural. And so I should back up and say, so actually just last night, Sheikh Abdullah Hamid Ali, who's a professor over at Zaytuna, who's from right here in Philly, one of our accomplished indigenous African-American Muslim scholars, one of our indigenous American Muslim scholars who is a graduate of the Qarawiyyin in Morocco. He gave a talk yesterday that was live streamed on the Zaytuna site, and he talked a little bit about this idea of separation. I'm not sure what word he used, but this sort of impulse among Black American folks, this sort of conversation among Black American folks about which strategy is most useful for achieving self-determination, right? To pursue a kind of integration, right? Or to establish self-determination by separating from sort of like the greater white supremacist society, right? When y'all know what I mean when I say white supremacist, right? White supremacist, I don't mean like neo-Nazis and the Klan. I mean, you know, the regime that sort of systematically disenfranchised non-white people, right? So, and he talks about, you know, he mentions kind of just in passing, Sheikh Abdullah did, that, you know, now we kind of call that nationalism, right? And we already talked about in the beginning of my talk, like why, like, this concept of nationalism, the nation state, how that's kind of like fraught, right? Because somebody has to get written out of your national project, right? But in the context of disenfranchised folks, right, this idea of nationalism takes on a different kind of tenor. So that same sort of impulse that Mona, you talked about of Black American people saying, no, we need to establish something for ourselves that's sort of separate and distinct, sometimes gets talked about within the context of Black nationalism, right? Becomes like the paradigm that we use, the sort of framework we use to discuss that approach. And that's a really truncated way of trying to explain it. But what we see that emerges in these Black American Muslim communities, like the Moorish Science Temple, like these different Black Sunni Muslim communities we talked about, is this sort of marriage between a kind of what we might call cultural nationalism, right? We might call cultural nationalism, which is this idea that we're going to try to be separate and self-determined and distinct with regard to the cultural and psychological, with regard to our sort of cultural and psychological life, if that makes sense. You following me, right? Is that a little bit too abstract? So cultural nationalism, this idea that, you know, part of separating from society is not just, okay, let's get some land and let's do our own thing over here, but we actually have to separate psychologically and culturally from this sort of broader repressive society that we're in sort of protest to, right? So you have a marriage between this kind of cultural nationalism in the form of groups like the Moorish Science Temple, who say, no, we're actually not black, we're Moorish, right? Or Professor Mohammed Izzuddin, some of his students, particularly in New Jersey, they embrace this idea of a sort of black Arab identity. Like, we're really Arab, you know? Not to say that we're like not, you know, darker skinned people, but again, like, what does it mean to say we're black? You know, that doesn't really tell you anything. We're really a part of this Arabic speaking world and culturally sort of Arabic Muslim world, right? Who are black, who are trying to be self-determined in America, right? Or in the case of somebody like Sheikh Daoud, a sort of embrace of a West African historical consciousness, right? So you begin to find people that are really getting into embracing West African musical forms, West African fashion, folks starting to travel to West Africa. You know, this is the kind of thing that you see happening in Harlem. So this marriage between that and a sort of political economic approach to achieving self-determination, right? Not establishing a nation within a nation per se, but trying to achieve as much self-determination in the context of these urban centers as possible. And then sort of the, I think in many ways, most prominent and most successful example of this from folks who are identifying as Muslim in our part of the world is the Nation of Islam. Of course, the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam sort of grows up alongside these other organizations. Actually, both of these other stories that I told you sort of predate the rise of the nation, but sometime around the 1950s, the Nation of Islam sort of outstrips everybody else in terms of an organized body, organized community of black American people who are identifying with Islam, who are embracing this strategy of self-determination. And because I don't want to go too much longer, I'll just sort of truncate my discussion of the Nation of Islam with a couple of sort of points to highlight just how successful they were in that. You have the Nation of Islam establishing the largest network of independent black schools in the nation at their height, the largest network of black businesses, right? So like the joke is, and it's not really a joke, it's really just an amazing sort of observation. The Nation of Islam sort of established a nation on newspapers and bean pies. The bean pie that you're eating, the history of that is that the Nation of Islam is what popularized this as a healthy alternative to, you know, other desserts that you might eat. And the nation really sort of promoted, similar to the Moorish Science Temple, this idea of healthy eating, right? Introducing healthy alternatives in terms of diet to the community in a way that influenced the broader community of non-Muslims as well as Muslims. Not unlike when we look at this West African, you know, paradigm of the Muslim clerics who say the way we're going to get people to embrace Islam is by being a benefit to them, right? We're gonna spread literacy. We're going to spread our knowledge of how to use sort of spiritual technology in practical ways, right? So like in West African context, you find that, you know, the religious scholar often also played the role of the doctor, of the healer, right? And so ruqya, you know, this idea of scriptural, religious, Quranic healing becomes sort of very developed in West Africa. So similarly in the context of you know, the African-American experience, where the number one killer of black people, or black men at least, is high blood pressure and hypertension, the Nation of Islam goes on its own sort of mission to sort of reform the diet and the health practices of folks in the African-American community. And so that's just sort of like a snapshot. And, you know, if you're really interested in the Nation of Islam, you know, and of course Malcolm X being its most sort of famous, prominent sort of advocate, Manning Marable, who's recently deceased, wrote a book called Malcolm X: A Life of Reinvention, and there's some serious problems with the book. You know what I mean? My brother is giving me the face like you brought up that one. Some serious problems with the book, and so you should enter the book knowing there's some serious problems with the book. But if you're a serious student of history, and when I say, I'll say this, there's some things in the book that make folks in the community uncomfortable that don't really seem very grounded, which is a little surprising because if you look at Manning Marable's career as a scholar, he's an amazing scholar, amazing historian. But this last book, there's some things in it that even I as a historian, I'm kind of like, well, where's your evidence for that? But it's a 600-page book, and that stuff is maybe 20 pages of the book, and the rest of the book gives you some really great insight into Malcolm's life. So as a historian, I think it would be beneficial, particularly in giving us a picture of the Nation of Islam as a sort of independent political economy. It's independent sort of political apparatus, right? So what allows Malcolm X to rise to the stature that he rises to, right? Part of it is that you have a national political economic infrastructure, independent political economic infrastructure with businesses, with schools, with cooperative economics that sort of galvanizes the economic resources of a largely working class community of people to create this viable national institution that allows people to sort of, if you will, maroon right in their urban spaces, right in Harlem, right in Chicago, right in Philadelphia, right in Newark, New Jersey, right? And then we have some later examples of Black Sunni Muslim organizations that in some ways, perhaps sort of inspired by the success of the Nation of Islam, are able to do the same thing, maybe on a smaller scale. So we have the Daoud Islam movement, which at one time is the largest network of Black American Sunni mosque in the country, and actually takes the name Daoud Islam, right? Because they're saying there's this concept that you find in the Islamic tradition among sort of, I guess what we might call sort of political economists or political theorists, right, of Islam, of Daoud al-Islam versus Daoud al-Harb, like the lands of Islam, the place where Islam can thrive, and the place where Islam is under attack, the places that are perpetually at war and not safe for the Muslims, right? And so the folks who found Daoud al-Islam are Black American Muslims who say, America is Daoud al-Harb. You know, this place is not really for us. We're under attack. The kinds of oppression that we face, and this is in the 1960s that Daoud al-Islam is formed, let us know that we're under attack as Black people and as Muslims in this part of the world. But we're going to try to develop a sort of outpost of Daoud al-Islam right here in America, in these urban spaces that we live, in Brooklyn and in LA, right? So, and Daoud al-Islam actually goes on to become attractive to a number of folks in the Black Power movement, including a number of members of the Black Panther Party. Probably the most prominent being a man named H. Rap Brown, who was a member of the Black Panther Party and one-time leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He is incarcerated. While incarcerated, he meets some folks from the Daoud al-Islam movement, becomes Muslim, takes the name Jamil Abdullah Alameen, becomes an imam in the community, and the Daoud al-Islam movement goes through its own sort of fracture, and Imam Jamil emerges as like sort of the leader of one sort of faction of that movement that's really sort of, doubles down on this idea of pursuing self-determination in these urban spaces, right? And so Imam Jamil, he, and this is something that you find is sort of a big part of sort of like Black American Muslim sort of oral tradition, this idea of community policing. Right, and so one of the things that Imam Jamil and his folks became known for is when they would find a bad area in the Black community that's bad because of all the different socioeconomic factors that make majority Black communities quote unquote bad, lack of access to good education, lack of access to quality policing, all these kinds of things. They would go and actually clean up the community themselves, right? And so this strategy is what he sort of takes with him when he goes to Atlanta, establishes in a community in Atlanta that does this successfully. Right now, Imam Jamil is locked up for life. We believe he's a political prisoner. A lot of the evidence suggests that he didn't do what he's incarcerated for doing. Wallahu alam, we make dua that Allah give Imam Jamil his freedom and vindicate him and reward him for all the things that he's done in the community. So that's one example. And then the last example I want to cite is an example that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which is the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, another community in Harlem. And I wanted to mention when I talked about the Nation of Islam that, in Harlem, right, where I used to live and where I'm doing my research, you have this strip on 116th Street. I don't know if any of you know New York, know Harlem, but you have this strip on 116th Street that now, unfortunately, is sort of changing drastically because of gentrification. But when I was there, it was known as Little Africa, right? Or some people call it Little Senegal, right? But really Little Africa, because there were folk there from Cote d'Ivoire and from Mali, from all these different places. And in Little Africa, there was this sort of beautiful ethnic enclave where you had Black American Muslims, West African Muslims who had businesses, who had different institutions, mosques that really sort of characterized the area, right? But before that, part of the reason why Little Africa was able to set itself up there is because this was the same area that during the time of the Nation of Islam, you found the Nation of Islam mosque, barbershop, restaurant, laundromat, all these kinds of institutions, right? Now, the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood was founded by folks who left, largely by folks who left the Nation of Islam when Malcolm with the Nation of Islam either left or was kicked out, depending on, I mean, both are really true. But the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood really sort of embraced the same idea of self-determination in a localized sort of context. So the story you always hear is when you walk by the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, you see all around the mosque, a few buildings adjacent, you see it's the sidewalk is painted green. And you know you better not get caught on that green paint doing anything that was unsavory, right? Because the Muslims would handle it, right? And I won't go into this too much, but we find with the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, with the Nation of Islam, with these different communities, often they were able to amass so much political economic power through their institutions that they built and through the relationships they built with the greater community of non-Muslim people who saw them as a benefit to the community, that they were able to leverage that power to actually negotiate with local government, right? Local law enforcement. Well, local law enforcement would say, okay, if something happens and the Muslims handled it, we know the Muslims handled it because somebody was doing something they didn't have no business doing. Somebody was engaged in some kind of criminal activity. So we're not gonna go and sort of come down on the Muslims because we know what they're doing, what they're about. And you would see this with ebb and flow. You might get a police commissioner who was particularly anti-Muslim and anti-black, who might, you know, give the Muslims some problems. And then you might have some other folks in law enforcement who may be Muslim themselves, or at the very least be products of this community who would advocate for the rights of the Muslims to be able to engage in these strategies of self-determination, right? So this is largely what you see happening in New York. The last example I give, Masjid Taqwa, right? Some of you may know about Imam Siraj Wahaj, very prominent imam from our community, was the founding imam and current imam of a mosque in Brooklyn called Masjid Taqwa in Brooklyn. Similarly, when Masjid Taqwa established itself, you know, was in not the best of communities, not the best of areas. Again, people, Black American Muslims who aren't sort of running from the problem, but actually trying to establish communities in the middle of these urban areas where they can benefit the most people, right? Establishes the community. As the story goes, a local Muslim business owner is harassed by some criminals, some drug dealers in the community, in the area, goes to the Muslims asking for help. The Muslims go to deal with the situation. They go see the drug dealers peacefully, non-violently, and the drug dealers call the police on the Muslims, who beat up the Muslims, right? And so after that, the Muslims say, okay, we see that these people are not here to help us. This particular sort of law enforcement, you know, institution, precinct, whatever you want to call it, this particular group of police officers are not here to help our community. We're gonna have to take matters into our own hands, right? And they mount, with the assistance of the Mosque of the Islamic Brotherhood, they mount this, I think it was like a 40-day anti-drug campaign where they basically cleaned up the community. And then there were folks in the law enforcement, in local law enforcement, who saw the benefit and actually advocated for the Muslims to be able to do what they were trying to do, engaging in these strategies of community policing. And they were able to create a sort of synergy. And ultimately they created, again, a sort of haven in the middle of what used to be not so great of a neighborhood in the middle of Brooklyn. So I just wanted to kind of go through that history a little bit to give some snapshots of the way in which Black American Muslims throughout our time here in the West have pursued these strategies of self-determination in different ways. And I want to kind of conclude by saying that it's important to understand, if we look at the way that Muslim societies, right, have dealt with issues of colonization, have dealt with issues of aggression on behalf of non-Muslim societies or peoples, the two sort of paradigms that we find are jihad and hijra, right? We hear these are the two, when you look into a lot of the legal works you find, particularly in West Africa, that's what I know most because that's what I study, you find discussions about jihad and hijra, right? And of course, you know, nowadays when people hear jihad, they think about, you know, violent movements to take control of a state. Part of that is because of a sort of propaganda campaign, right? Because when you ask somebody what's the translation of jihad, they'll tell them holy war, right? But holy war is actually a term that comes out of the Crusades, right? Of Western Europe, the Crusades in the Muslim world. But the scholars of Islam and the scholars who've had to deal with issues of colonization have talked about different forms of jihad, right? And so jihad very often was not seen as a sort of violent endeavor. In fact, in some cases, jihad actually meant going out and using things like education and being a benefit to the community to help to build that kind of power and to bring support to your cause. And of course, we all know, well, I'm not going to say we all know, but, you know, there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ tells us that the greatest jihad is the inner jihad, right? Like fighting against your own nafs, right? Fighting against your own lower self, your own ego, your own desires that impede you from achieving spiritual liberation, right? And this is in the literature of you know, tazkiyat an-nafs or tasawwuf. Sometimes this is talked about as a person oppressing oneself, right? Going back to what I shared from Imam Talib, right? The person who isn't able to serve their higher self, isn't able to be a servant of God, will spend their life, you know, dealing with anonymous, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, gambling, this kind of thing, right? And so the idea is that in order to achieve spiritual liberation, right, it requires a type of self-determination. You can't have self-determination without having a type of spiritual liberation, without having spiritual liberation. Every single one of these communities and organizations that I talked about, their ultimate goal was to promote a way of living that was the most healthy for human development, right, for human dignity. This is one of what we call the maqasid al-sharia. One of the goals of the sharia is to maintain human dignity, right? And so all of these communities were engaged in that. And they found that the best way to obtain that was through these peaceful means of establishing political economic power, you know, establishing self-determination, the ability to live in communities that are healthy and that are spiritually healthy and wholesome. And often, in some cases, you find that they would even use this language of hijra, right? So, so you have, when you look at the sort of discourses around hijra and jihad, right? What we find is often hijra, particularly in the African context, is seen as a way to sort of escape the ravages of a society or regime that is not allowed for a sort of healthy, wholesome life, right? And jihad is seen as engagement with the society, right? Particularly nonviolent engagement, right? Because what distinguishes these responses, right, to colonization and oppression is the idea that the goal is not to take control of the state, right? The goal is not to take control of the state. And that may seem kind of in the weeds, but it's important. It's important. Because, and this is what my friend Dr. Bilal Ware, Dr. Rudolph Ware, he says that in the Muslim world, there was the realization of the need to separate church and state. Just as in the Western world, I'm paraphrasing him, there was this realization of the need to separate church and state. But in the West, it was to protect the state. For the Muslims, it was to protect the spiritual tradition, right? And so what you see emerging from the vast majority of the Muslim world and these Black American attempts by Muslims to achieve self-determination, I would say is very much a continuity, is very much a part of this greater sort of paradigm of folks who are attempting to achieve this self-determination to engage in cultivating spiritually healthy communities, right? Not by sort of overtaking a state, not by engaged in any sort of violent resistance, right? But rather by establishing communities themselves, right? Even in the midst of the ways in which they are under attack by states, right? And the only way that you can do that, the only way that you can actually try to establish these kinds of communities and try to achieve self-determination in the face of states and governments and empires attacking you is with faith, right? Is with faith. Muhammad Ali, who we all celebrate, you know, we celebrate him now, but there was a time when he was very unpopular when he spoke out against the Vietnam War. And he was stripped of his title, and hopefully all of you know the story. And what made Muhammad Ali, what sort of distinguished him is the fact that none of that stuff really mattered to him because of his faith, right? Because of his faith. And so in the era that we currently live, right, where a lot of people in our Muslim community and in the various communities that we're all a part of and connected to are feeling under attack, a feeling that, you know, we're meeting a sort of crisis, right? I think the biggest lesson that we can draw from this is that if we have faith, right? If we have faith and we continue to engage in trying to build the kinds of communities and societies that we want with faith, then God will see us through. And God seeing us through can look a lot of different ways, right? But at the end of the day, what I hope you take from these lessons, from these sort of snapshots through history, is that the aim should not be to sort of, as you put it, assimilate, right? To sort of go along to get along, to sort of make Islam another box that you can check along with, you know, this is my race, this is my religion, this is my gender, this is my sexual orientation, this is my ethnicity, but rather to use it as a sort of guiding principle that motivates us to be able to pursue these ideals of a healthy, wholesome, spiritually fulfilling, self-determined society, even if it looks bleak, right? Even if it seems like the president is against you. If God is on your side, who's the president? And that's my presentation. And I guess hopefully, if it's not too late and y'all are still awake, we have a little bit of time, hopefully, for maybe some questions. Y'all.